I have a question for all of you as practitioners about what have been good practices from institutions or archives that you've worked with, um, in terms of thinking as a Labour activist. Are there good practices? Perhaps there aren't, or what good practices you'd like to see and foster?
I guess I'll start. It's less an experience in terms of. I mean, I guess as a curator, a really good experience I've had is with Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, in terms of acknowledging the fact that when I worked there as a curator in residence around the exhibition, there was a direct acknowledgement of the fact that there is an issue of a general issue, I mean, across the museum sector, of lots of people wanting to enact change from within their institutions in terms of queering the museum, in terms of decolonizing the museum. But it can't be necessarily done from an activist perspective, and there's lots of barriers and labor that comes into play around that. So I was able to kind of implement my stance thanks to the museum coming in as not only a curator but also an activist. But I must say that this was helped by the fact that MIMA is a place which is already doing the work of trying to deconstruct itself, in terms of not seeing itself as a space that kind of delivers down knowledge, but tries and makes itself a collaborative social space, where there's, I think up till unfortunately recently, due to lockdown, weekly free lunches for the community, different kind of community workshops, and this idea that different constituents, so kind of local members of the community who visit the museum, can use the space in different ways that aren't just related to the enjoyment of the collection and exhibitions. So that was a really powerful one for me. I mean, another really good experience was with the Vagina Museum, which is kind of interesting because it's not a museum with a collection. It's an exhibition space that's engaging around gynecological anatomy, from a perspective that is specifically feminist, queer, and trans-inclusive, and working with them in drag and kind of enacting parodies with them around patriarchal, racist, homophobic institutions, with pop-ups like the Museum of Mankind, was a good way of, basically kind of trying to understand what these new kind of grassroots museums could be like and how they can help challenge the status quo.
Two examples. So the first is that recently I was in another Zoom with people connected tangentially or not to Jatiwangi Art Factory, which is a residency I did way back. I was an artist in residence for their Village Video Festival. So basically Jatiwangi Art Factory, it's really decentralized. Everybody in the villages of Jatiwangi are involved in the art. You have people like housewives, police members, everyone talking about video art and all of these ideas in the village. And the Zoom call was an international one because they have international artist residencies, and talking about survival strategies for artists during this pandemic. And I was so incredibly inspired by hearing about institutions that are more, communities like MES 56 in Yogyakarta, which is a city in Java, and other artist collectives that have open soup kitchens where artists who literally are starving during this pandemic can literally just come and eat. And they were producing there's one presentation where they produced a comic book detailing how these mutual aid collaboratives worked, down to like, we have transparency about our finances, everything. And it was really, really beautiful to see. And the second thing I will say is that I didn't show any of my performance artwork. There's one performance on the website, I believe, where all of our works are really beautifully placed, that I did at the ICA. And in that performance, and in every performance I've done for about the past 9 years, I've requested that where I perform, people should feel comfortable lying down. So at the ICA, they provided beanbags where people could lie down. Center for Contemporary Art Vilnius, I had this exhibit, I had this show where I requested they put like really comfy bedding all over, and the whole performance was about getting people to lie down, but because they were mostly curators, they immediately were like, oh, we can lie down. So that's another way in which it's, albeit temporary, because when the show leaves, then it's back to being a space where people feel uncomfortable lying down. It's one way in which, we can try and chip away at this institutional ableism.
So I worked at a museum for 3 years. I worked at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, PA, which is the first museum and art school in the country. And I was a visitor experience associate, so I was in the museum every day, and we were always confronted with very racist imagery. And when we would talk to the curators about it, they wouldn't really respond in a way that was helpful. It was just like a part of the collection. The painting was there. There's nothing that can be done. They're not going to rearrange. They're not going to rearrange the paintings. They're just going to leave them there. And it's like when kids are there, when families are there, and you're talking to them about this work, and it was a really problematic experience for a lot of us, because most of the visitor experience associates were Black or Hispanic, and we were just talking about these, because there would be paintings of pickaninnies, which were, little Black kids dressed in the suits of their owners. And then we also had paintings that were done by actual artists who owned slaves. So it was just a problem. And they only had 2 paintings at a time of African American artists. So, and I would always look up to see what was in our collection. We had a vast amount of African American artists, and I just wondered why these people were never out there. They were never displayed, and it was just a problem. And I was always thinking about that, especially after I left.
Yeah, it's so sad to hear, and obviously something that we unfortunately, it's an experience that I recognize, unfortunately, and I'm sure many of us do. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. I had a good experience. I had a good experience yesterday on a Zoom call, just like this, with I was giving a talk with, I mean, the whole thing was kind of a dream. I was giving a talk with a friend of mine who I admire greatly and was trying to make my friend for a very long time before I feel like we reached that title, and called Dr. Tanzila Wenson. And we gave a talk together where she presented her work and I presented my work as well. And it was it was an exhibition for, I'm going to get them, it's this, not an exhibition, a talk for the students of the Spitzer School of Architecture at City College of New York. And the whole conversation was chaired by the wonderful Leslie Loco, who is a pioneer, a Black woman who's the pioneer of basically thinking, sorry, not pioneer, erase that word, innovator in thinking about Black space, Blackness as it relates to architecture, race as it relates to architecture. And this is a huge deal because before Leslie Loco, there wasn't anyone thinking about, well, there were people thinking about it, there were people experiencing it, but within academia, there wasn't any formal books and papers written about how race and architecture intersect, which is unbelievable. If I hadn't been through architectural education quite recently and seen still how literally there's not even often a conversation of how gender relates to space, let alone how race relates to space. So that was a great experience, to be in conversation with 3 Black women that I admire, with a Black woman, Leslie Locke, who is not only an expert in the field that I work in, but also is the dean of that school. And and subsequently after that meeting, I've asked her for advice, and she's like come through with that advice and more. And yeah, it's just been really great. I've just been like, wow. I mean, my state of mind today in comparison with how it was yesterday is incomparable, really. And this is what can happen when you have a moment of decolonization.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I have kind of an example of kind of good practice that comes to mind now. But I'm just thinking how when there are projects that are trying to do this thing within certain institutions. So I'm thinking about the Decolonizing the Arts Institute at the UAL. How difficult it is to do that when the whole institution is built on structures of systemic racism. And Oka was saying this before. With all the fact that there is the UAL Truth account that is now publishing all these stories, and how difficult it is when the whole institution is actually built also with this, employment structures that are that are incredibly racist. How it's possible actually to operate and to do a certain kind of work within this institution is very difficult, because there is also the spaces seem not to communicate with each other, and they have been co-opted in that kind of tokenistic sort of aspect, or kind of void gestural politics, and this is so kind of widespread in academic institutions in the UK. I'm also teaching at the Royal College of Arts, where there are incredible problems of systemic racism in terms of senior management, in terms of employment practices, and so it's really it's I don't know, it's I guess it's trying to figure out how you can kind of, hijack rather than be co-opted by the institution, and how that can be done. So.
And I also work at UAL, so I'm particularly interested in that respect. But also, obviously, there's general lessons that can apply. But have UAL been specifically trying to co-opt the work that you're doing at this moment of white people paying attention to Black Lives Matter?
I'm not sure 100%, in the sense that I'm doing the residency with the institute at UAL, but I'm not, and this is the strange thing when you are a resident in an institution, but you're not really involved into it, right? So I know much better things at the RCA, where there is being a kind of continuous trying to co-opt certain things, and that were not trying to put the institution in a beautiful kind of sort of light, kind of co-opting and exploiting the work that was done by other people, and not just that, kind of completely reverting the work that was done. So maybe Oka knows more. Just a bit more, because I have 2 jobs at the same institute, one of which is the other one, apart from being researcher in residence where I do art, is being a research fellow with a specialty in decolonizing curricula. So the research fellows have different specialties. And so I am I've already, in the short time I've been at UAL, been in quite a few meetings discussing recent events. And there's actually something so said about labor practices. And it's interesting, because I'm in the work that I do, which also involves a lot of research as practice, as art practice. I'm finding myself looking at my contract a lot and recognizing the importance of unions. I'm part of the Society of Authors. They've given me free legal advice for years, and it's great. And I think in material terms, I think that's something that all of us need to be aware of, is our rights. what belongs to us legally and the arguments that we can make for maintaining our work as ours and not the institutions. So.
I'm going to jump back in here just because I want to put out the question that Jay asked in their preamble to the movie, which I think is a really good question to ask all of you. They said, how do you move from the archive as a mechanism of the state and, paraphrasing slightly, and bridge the gap to which it becomes knowledge? I don't have an answer to that, but I really would love to know what you guys think would be ways in which to do that.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. I'll also type it in the chat. How do you move from the archive as a mechanism of the state to something which becomes knowledge? So I think they meant, how do you move from an archive being an accumulation of things to which an institution can hold on to and use to then, I think they mean how it becomes public knowledge.
I think to start, make the archives publicly accessible. A lot of archives are just not, even on the internet, you can't even, you can't access them. And actually, even if you're willing to travel wherever, you still won't be able to access them. I'm still so confused. I don't know if anyone has the answer to this, but why are the BBC archives not accessible to the public, even just to view? We pay for them. It's a public service. And surely the BBC archives are perhaps the first tier archive, right? Everyone knows who the BBC is. People are interested in TV programs because, popular culture. And yet it's one of the most exclusive archives to access. It's almost impossible unless you're going to air the program and pay a licensing fee. You actually can't watch them as a researcher, even with institutional backing. You need that. So that's one way that it could become knowledge.
I definitely agree in terms of the access. And it's just this really weird thing as well. It's something we talk a lot with the LGBTQI Archive Collective in France, is that lots of responses we had from big institutions, such as the Archives Nationales in France, was things like, oh, but we already have the Paris archives. People can just come and visit them anytime. And it was just this really weird thing of trying to explain that we wanted an archive that was accessible to all members of the LGBTQI plus community, that could be accessed in a way that wasn't just kind of jumping through research hoop after research hoop. And it's an issue that lots of people feel about the museum as well, is that you can have all the queer exhibitions you want, but I've had lots of queer friends and trans friends tell me, I don't want to go in that specific museum. It's intimidating to me. It feels like I'm being talked down to. So it's, I definitely agree that access is key, but also it's just turning the archive into conversations, into parties, into stuff that just relates to our lives, I think. Because otherwise it's just something I feel it's also something where there's this weird fetishization of the object, and you absolutely have to hold the object, and it's so beautiful, but we live in a digital world, and I think the fetishization of an object at the expense of actually understanding how its history can be reinterpreted and accessed is kind of linked to this whole obsession with statues that some people have been having about the fact that, oh God, God forbid we remove this crusty old bronze monument from public space. If it's, sorry, I won't go on a tangent about statues because that's not an entirely different debate. But yeah, I'd say it's just breaking that idea of having to access this one specific object and turning it into something that's just relating to people's lived experiences.
I wonder if, the archive, the meaning of the archive is the house of the archon, the house of the ruler. And it's a classical Greek word. And there is, as someone who works as a kind of community archivist and works with the archives of individuals and community organizations, what you come up against the whole time is exactly what you describe with the BBC, of this kind of can't. There's an absolute refusal to extend the mechanisms that would allow for access. So digitization is expensive. We can't do activation days or allow free access because people might damage the materials. So it's exactly the objects over lives and communities logic that capitalism spreads everywhere. So dismantling capitalism, abolitionism of the whole system of gatekeeping, policing, and an understanding of what these objects are, which I think is particularly activated, or I've seen particularly activated by indigenous groups globally speaking to museums saying this object is dead when it's in your museum. Like, you can say you're preserving it, but actually you've killed it, you've destroyed it, because what preserves it in the understanding of a community practice is its use, its continual remaking through living use. And so we'd have to completely recenter our understanding of history and memory and who gets to determine them, to see that community use and embodied knowledge are the most important ways of understanding our histories and our historical objects. And introducing performances into the museum is, as Oka said, it changes it for that moment, and hopefully it changes minds and it builds ideas. But so far, gatekeepers have very rarely taken that on as changing the whole practice of what an archive is and what it can do. It has to be led by the communities and bodies of those people, of the people to whom the objects or practices are meaningful, like permanently, not just for one day.
I'd also really love more dialogue between community archivists in the UK and those in other countries like Indonesia that have been colonized by the UK at some point. There's a place called Indonesian Visual Art Archive also in Jogja, and it's basically, it was last time I checked, it was still all women run and really into community archiving and sub-nation state or non-nation state formulations of archiving, and I believe that some of their work has been translated into English. But yeah, I think we need a lot more collaboration and not so much insularity about the UK, especially when the British Museum is loot from everywhere. So yeah, no assumption that the best practices are the ones that claim to be originated in metropolitan centers. Actually, I think as a film historian, for me, informal archives of film in places in regions of Brazil and in Mexico where those archives are being shaped against the state doesn't want the archives to exist, is looking to destroy them. In Albania as well, where archiving was outlawed. It was, archiving films from before Enver Hoxha's regime was a, imprisonable offense. That there are so many practices that we could be sitting and listening to and not assuming any form of leadership or innovation. Yeah,
and I like the fact that Jay uses the word knowledge in the question, and I'm thinking how that knowledge is not fixed and how it has to be kind of, sort of reconstructed all the time in a way, and how that can only happen in that sort of living use and in that kind of moments of conversations where the material of the archive is outside of that kind of gatekeeping or sort of police borders that are built. And so it can happen only in that sort of interaction that has to be a living and embodied interaction. I just think that, and then knowledge is not one, it's not fixed, but it's kind of, repeated and recursive, and it has to be remade and refashioned all the time.
I think they would have really liked that discussion, and thankfully we're recording it, so we'll send it to Jay so that they can watch this really great conversation. I honestly, I don't know what to say. It's just, like I said in the chat, I wish I could snap at everything. I know that we've gone over almost 15 minutes, but if you guys are okay, I'm very happy to continue on the discussion if you would like. Otherwise, we can maybe have one question from the audience. I know that some people have left because of time, but if anyone who's watching wants to ask a question, please put it in the chat and I can read it out to our amazing panelists now. Jade asks, how do ableist models of disability and wellness show up in our own lives as people working in the archives / the arts?
All the time, no? It's like, yeah, in everything you do. And I mean, I was like, yeah, really grateful to Hoka when we started doing like the first meetings to raise that question, because it's something that I hadn't thought about before, and it's something that is present like physically in the way in which the archive is built, in like the space of the archive. Again, like also what Rosa-johan was saying before about like that architectural space and how that also creates not just inaccessibility, but also the sort of intimidation and the fact that you feel alien and out of place in the spaces. So it's all these things bound together, and they happen at every turn. And it's so like important when you are able-bodied to see all these things and to try to understand them, because they are everywhere.
I don't want to assume to speak for someone else, but what Janyce was saying about working in the museum has really stayed with me, because I think there is an assumption of being able to cope both physically and emotionally with traumatic materials when we work with archival materials or in museum spaces. And in some situations, that's being able to cope with materials that we experience as traumatic, and others present as being normative or refuse to see the trauma. And then in some cases, working on records of genocides, exclusions, they're materials that are recognized as traumatic, but there's no space made, like literally the physical space or emotional space, for the impact of dealing with that material. And I think some of the best writing right now by archivists and about archival work is about that impact, and how it's asymmetrical and differential, and why some people, as Claire said, feel more comfortable going into a particular museum building or archive and accessing work without having that experience, and that is an access issue for us as viewers, as well as artists and archivists. And I don't know what to do about that, but I want to acknowledge it.
I think it's really important to acknowledge that, especially when racism is felt in the body, right? It's bodily, and even apologies can be traumatic. I mean, apologies for racism, personal experience can be traumatic. So I think not feeling so alone and communal healing is really important. Like I love, Janyce, the work that you're doing, and also combining visual art and writing in such a beautiful way. And Rosa, I mean, I'm gonna be sharing that performing way in this video. I love it so much. It's so important to, I think, I sound like a broken record, but just continue these ties with each other that are non-exploitative, that are, as So said, are non-hierarchical, right? And to continue to help each other, because I do think also there's a way in which people who do deal with these archives, even when they talk about trauma, even when they talk about racism, even when they use the words, they don't understand, right? They don't understand. And I keep thinking about this gap, and yeah, this is something for future conversation. But there's this, it's like the privilege of not experiencing things bodily that always comes into it.
Yeah, it's like, can you claim workplace injury for like the agenda item on Black Lives Matter? Can you? I might try, but I'll let you know. Just seeing it sometimes.
Well, I should also share that at the museum that I had previously worked at, they had shared this statement that they were against it. They were opposed to Black Lives Matter. And I thought that was a problem. And it made me remember all my experiences at the museum, how it was emotional, especially because it was a museum that was mostly frequented by white people, and how those people would interact with us would be so detrimental sometimes. Even when I was working at special events, I would have drunk people touch my hair and, talk to me in like a way that was unprofessional. But my supervisor would be watching these things and just be like, well, he won't remember it tomorrow. But it's like, but I'm going to remember that. And it's like, there was a sense of uncare at the museum that I had to live with. And, yeah, it was just, there was a lot of horrible things that went on, and for them to release this statement that they were opposed to Black Lives Matter, I was like, well, it kind of makes sense because of, this is the kind of institution they are. And then they also backtracked and made another statement that said that they changed their minds on the whole thing and they feel bad and all this other stuff. And I just feel like there needs to be a systematic change there with all the people that work there and even the board members. I feel like it just needs to be reconstructed. So, yeah, so a group of people proposed a change.org petition against them. And I signed it, and there were all these people in there, including like some of the most famous painters that are in existence right now. And I was just like, wow, she's on this, he's on this. Like, there's a lot of people who really want change there at this institution. And I really, really hope that comes.
What is the institution?
At the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia.
Well, that's amazing that you've got so much support. I really hope that something changes because, I'm gobsmacked by that. It's one thing to have like institutions being like toothpaste and posting their web and then like discriminating actively and firing their like black and brown employees, as you have many universities over in the UK and I'm sure in the US as well. But another thing for a museum to come out and say somewhere where you worked to say that. Wow, I'm sorry that happened.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Janyce. I'm so sorry that's just thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I really hope and want this change to happen. And I think that we all agree that part of these conversations is about how do we figure out ways to be able to bring that change, bring what you are all discussing in this Zoom call into the physical space, whether it be the museum gallery or the archive. And I think there's a lot of hierarchy within archives, as you all have been saying, about how do you take it out of things that you can't touch into the personal, the physical, everyone should and access their own history. Because it's more than 20 past, I think I'm gonna bring Jade and Lottie back in and say thank you again so much to all of you for being a part of this call for so long and for sharing all of your work with us. It means so much, especially as we know it was a little bit late notice to organize this, but we can't be more grateful to you all. And yes, just thank you so much. We're really in awe of everything that you guys do.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to echo Susanna, yeah, thank you so much. This has been amazing. The other thing to say is, obviously a 2-hour Zoom call is not enough time to unpack and think through all of the things that we've been discussing today. We're really happy with people's permission to share each other's email addresses, to like make links and connections between people. We can facilitate that, and we'll be back in touch soon about next steps and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you so much, and I'm going to have a very thoughtful evening, I think. That's where I'm going to go just have a cup of tea and think through everything. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone.
I'll plug that if you want to have some fun, we're going to have a Dada costume party tomorrow, so do join. But it'll be great. There'll be a DJ plugging in, but don't want to take too much more. Thank you guys. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye everyone. So nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet everyone. Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye.